Hello, Fit Model friends. Today I'm going to answer this problem, how to set up the perfect fit model front pose. So most athletes are told what to do in a front pose. You know what it looks like, but few understand how and why things work the way that they do. That's why I created this presentation. Most posing advice is very vague, and you have to rely on a lot of pictures and ambiguous language to figure it out. So I wanted to create a data-driven way to create some sort of system that's actually scalable for most people to follow. Of course, every single statement that I'm going to make is going to have a caveat of it depends, because of course, it depends on your physique, what you're working with, and what your structure is like. But this is going to give you at least a good guideline to start with. So the problem again that I want to solve is that a lot of coaches or advice given online tells you things like, oh, a little bit more than hip width apart, or a little bit this way, or angle tiny bit like that. But my question is how much? What's a number? What's the quantitative metric that I can apply to this systematically? The approach that I took to solve this problem is I reverse engineered recent winning physiques to create a data-driven framework of how to set up your perfect front pose. The outcome that you're going to walk away with if you watch this complete video is you'll learn why these strategies work and leave with at least basic foundational formulas with an understanding of biomechanics of why certain strategies, foot positioning, waist angles, hip angles work to create a winning physique on stage. So let me tell you a little bit about the methodology and the approach that I took. I selected 4 athletes who have recently won their pro cards. Picked them because they most accurately reflect today's standards and the most current standard. I included myself because at least I can speak anecdotally to myself why I use the strategies that I do. Whereas the other 3 athletes, I can only assume, make an educated assumption of why they took this approach. So if you're gunning for a pro card and running the national circuit, every single thing that you do is intentional. So I believe that all 4 athletes here that I'm presenting to you have architectured their front pose a specific way for a very specific reason. Now, let's cut to the chase. I'm going to tell you my thesis and work backwards from there and tell you how I came to this conclusion, showing you all the data and observations to support it. So, in summary, the perfect ratio, if you're using your shoulder width as your 100% base foundation, then your waist ratio should be about 60% of your shoulder width, and your foot stance should land at about 120%. I use the shoulder as the 100% metric because that is the part that is the most structurally constraining, because you don't get to really control how wide your clavicles are. Whereas your foot stance is the easiest to modify, and your waist ratio is something that you can semi-control with your angles. So first key insight is that this is the golden ratio that works on winning physiques. 100 for shoulders, 60% for your waist width, and 120% for your foot stance, right? The foot stance is very important. So is your foot angle, because the way you set up your feet is actually going to determine the range of motion that you're going to have with your hips. And then when we get into how to create that glute pop, the glute pop has 2 variables that are important. One is axial rotation and pelvic tilt. And your strategy for that is largely going to depend on what are you working with. How much glute do you have, and what's the SWOT analysis of your glute density and structure? And when it comes to the strategy and angle for your waist, it's really prioritizing and balancing the trade-off between what you're working with your glute situation and your shoulder situation, because that's going to be the narrowest part of your front pose. And that's going to depend on the top and bottom structure so that you can create the narrowest silhouette in the midsection. Okay, so before I get into the meat and potatoes, let me introduce the athletes to you. So I'm going to go from left to right. So first is Emma, and then Evelyn, that's me. And then number 3 is Brooklyn, and number 4 is Schwann. One hypothesis I had in terms of variables that matter for setting up that perfect front pose is, does height matter? So I looked at each person's height class, right? And here's what I found. So, and also this is just based on NPC News Online and looking at which height classes each person competed in, right? So Emma, she's somewhere between 5'4" and 5'6" based on the class that she competed in. And she, I believe, is a class C, right? Me, I'm a smidge over 5'6", so I'm in class D. Brooklyn, I know she's class D, but I've seen her in real life. I saw her at junior NASM, so she's definitely at least an inch taller than me. So she's on the taller side. And then Schwann is class B. So it's going to be clear later on what actually makes a difference, but height doesn't actually matter so much in terms of your strategy. But what I did notice as I was analyzing each person's physique is that Brooklyn and Schwann have a lot more structural similarities, and me and Emma have some structural similarities. And what matters more is the torso length. Brooklyn and Schwann, when you look at the relative proportion to the rest of their body, have slightly longer torsos compared to the first 2 competitors over here. So a lot of people ask me, how wide should your feet be, right? A lot of people say, oh, just a little bit wider than your shoulder width or your hip width. But how much, right? Here's the math for you, right? I use shoulder width as a 100% baseline metric. And if that is your 100%, then your foot stance, based on winning physiques, should land somewhere between 120% or 130%, because that's what's creating the best illusion that's going to win you a pro card. So as you can see, she's about 115, I'm about 125, Brooklyn is about 130, and Schwann is about 120. So the conclusion here is that an average of about 120% in comparison to your shoulder width is going to be a good starting point for you to figure out your foot stance, right? Of course, there's always the caveat of it depends on your structure and what you're working with, but start with that if you have nowhere to start. And if you look at the waist ratios, because that's supposed to be the narrowest part of the hourglass, winning physiques tend to have somewhere between 58 to 65% of their shoulder width being their waist width. So that is how narrow you want your waist to look to create the shape that they want in Fit Model. Now that you have your foot stance, what angle should each foot be pointing, right? So let's look at the back foot first. If you look at the back foot, these winning competitors, pro card winning competitors, tend to set their back foot at this angle, right? The average is about 62.5 degrees to be very accurate. There's a reason for this. So the back foot angle matters because it's going to determine your twist capacity for your front hip. So you, depending on your glute structure and your glute strength, you might need to twist more to make that glute visible. The back foot angle is going to determine the amount to which your pelvis can rotate. So think of your back foot like the edge of a door, and your front foot is the door that's going to swing open if you think of your hips that way, right? So steeper angle allows deeper hip rotation and your ability to pull that front glute to show from the front. But if you do a smaller angle, it's going to restrict your ability to twist, which is not necessarily a bad thing, because as we get further into the presentation, you'll see why certain people use certain angles, because everything is strategic. Now let's look at the front foot angle. The data is telling us that winning competitors are angling their front foot around 37 degrees. Why is that? Think about your front foot as a direction setter. So your front foot is going to determine your pelvic alignment and how open or closed it is. I also only realized upon doing this analysis that actually me and Emma have very similar structures and front pose strategy, and that Brooklyn and Schwann have very similar strengths and strategies when it comes to their front pose. I only realized this after making this presentation. Okay, so now you have the foot stance and the angle of each foot, back foot and front foot. Now you're probably going to ask, hey, so how much weight should be shifted into each foot? So now let's talk about weight distribution. One consistent observation is that the back foot is always loaded more heavily than the front foot. So Emma and me, we have a little bit more of a dramatic weight shift to the back, whereas Brooklyn and Schwan are a little more like even, not completely even, but it's less dramatic. I'm almost like a 80-20. I literally put just enough weight on my front toe so I can drive it and flex my quad just a little bit. But the main thing I'm trying to do is drive enough energy to the ground so I can flex that front glute. And for me and my structure and what I'm working with, cueing myself that way actually gives the best illusion of separation between the glute and the rest of my leg, and also the biggest amount of pop and roundness. Now, let's talk about the pelvis. So I know it's going to sound weird, but think of my face as your pelvis, right? There's yeses and nos, right? When you go to jiu-jitsu, you do these weird neck exercises, right? So this, when you're saying no, think of that as your pelvic rotation, your axial rotation, right? And then think of this as your anterior pelvic tilt. And think of this movement when your pelvis is tilted down, as you are in your back pose, right? Tilted up to the back versus tilted to the front. So think of my face as your pelvis. I know that sounds weird, but it's going to make sense. So the angle that I'm showing and describing to you here is basically the rotation, the transverse rotation relative to your shoulders and legs, right? So as you can see, me and Emma are turning to the left way more dramatically compared to Brooklyn and Schwan. They're a little bit more head on. Okay, so now let's talk about the nose, the pelvic tilt, anterior versus posterior, right? So the first two athletes, me and Emma, have a very high axial rotation to the left. We're dramatically turning our hips to 45-degree angle and then also dramatically tilting our pelvis, right? I am driving my right hip bone down and diagonal to the floor. Whereas Brooklyn, like I can't tell without their faces. Brooklyn and Schwan have a medium rotation, right? They're only 25 to 35 degrees turned to the left. And then their pelvic tilt is there, but it's a lot softer. It's a lot less dramatic. And that led me to wonder why, right? Because all 4 front poses were winning physiques. This was the strategy that each athlete decided to go with, and it works well for them. Got them their pro cards. It looks really good and the shape looks really good, but they're all taking a slightly different approach. And I really wanted to understand why. How come like Schwan doesn't need to twist as hard, right? And why does Brooklyn's front pose look better this way than the other? And the thing is, I've actually tried both. For the SAC show, my first NPC show, I actually took Brooklyn's approach and did this front pose. But ultimately, this approach number A, works a lot better for me, and I'm going to get into why. So the ultimate goal that we're trying to achieve in that front pose shape is a little bit of roundness and pop to that glute, right? So we should look at the glutes. What's happening on the back side? So I took everyone's back shot, and then I did a SWOT analysis of each person's glute shape, density, projection, and structure. And here is what I found. This was the huge unlock. I'm like, oh, me and Emma have similar butts. And maybe Brooklyn and Schwan have similar butts. But if you really look at, hey, where does each athlete have the most amount of projection and density? For me, it's like in this middle part right here, right? You got to see me from the back to understand, oh, she has glutes, right? That's why I need to turn so dramatically to the side so I can make that middle meat really pop from the front, right? And I can't really speak for Emma, but it also looks like she has pretty strong projection in the glute max here, right? Another similarity that me and Emma have is that we have relatively shorter tie-ins, right? I can say for myself that my tie-ins are like very short, right? You can see it looks more like a ball. Whereas if you look at the tie-ins of Brooklyn and Schwan, they have the almond-shaped glutes, right? And now let's just switch over to Brooklyn and Schwan here. I mean, they just have a lot more glutes that can show from the front. You can just see from the shape that there's a lot of shape in the upper outer glutes and then also on the sides. So they have projection coming from multiple angles, whereas for me, I really need to dramatically twist to make that meat show. The key takeaway is this: the amount you rotate and tilt is ultimately dependent on what you're working with on your backside. It depends on your glute shape and density. If your biggest glute strength is glute max, then you might need to turn a little bit more dramatically, like me, higher axial rotation and a more dramatic tilt to your pelvis to make that show from the front. But if you're more glute med dominant, or if you just have glutes all day long, everywhere from every angle, then you may not need to do as dramatic of an axial rotation. You can just do like a medium amount and also not tilt so dramatically. Your waist angle at this point is a byproduct of how you set up everything else: your feet, the hips, and the shoulders. Once you get to the waist, the goal is to find an angle that's going to give you the most flattering and narrow taper in the middle to create an hourglass shape. Visually, you want to find an angle that's going to compress it the most while being able to control your core without flaring your ribs or looking so distorted, because ultimately you want to look comfortable, right? You want to just look like, I woke up like this and this is how I walk on the beach every day, which is not true. But yeah, you got to find that perfect angle that you can hold your core, you can control your core, keep it tight, and not really flare your ribs so much, but twist enough, depending on how much you twisted your hips back. So this is why mobility matters, because you need to find an angle where you can handle the hip twist, but also be able to twist both of your shoulders forward so they can see both your left and your right shoulder. To summarize, the golden ratio is 100% shoulder width, then about 60% width as your waist, and then your foot stance should start somewhere around 120%. If you have no idea where to start with this and then tweak it from there, right? The foot stance and angle is ultimately going to determine how much you're able to twist and open that hinge, right? And then your axial rotation and the tilt really depends on what you're working with in terms of your glutes, right? This is also under the assumption that you have glutes. If you don't have glutes, I don't know, you might just need a different approach. And then the waist, it's kind of the final cherry on top. But depending on how much you twisted your hip, you're going to have to really weigh the trade-offs between how much you're going to twist. Because you can twist all the way to the side to make your waist look as thin as possible. But then what about your glute and what about your shoulders, right? So the waist at that point is finding the most optimal angle so your core looks tight while balancing the visibility of your glutes and also your ability to twist forward to showcase both of your shoulders, right? Because your shoulders are the top of the hourglass, and that's also super important. If you're still paying attention, first of all, I'm very grateful, but you might be wondering, who are you and why should I listen to you? So let me give you a little bit of context about who I am. Outside of bodybuilding, my job is to understand what users need and balance it with business outcomes. I basically take complex problems, deconstruct it into manageable parts, and come up with actionable recommendations that are going to save the company more money or make more money for the company and also delight users. And before bodybuilding, I was an R&D chef working at the world's best restaurants, and I actually launched my own Michelin-Starred restaurant in Finland. In terms of my nutritional knowledge, I did a NASM cert for Certified Nutrition Coaching. So I'm very well versed in bodybuilding macros and how to turn macros into delicious meals. Like, I literally had ice cream and brownies every single day until peak week of all of my preps. And in the context of bodybuilding, I have been competing since 2022. I did 2 seasons in bikini, and my most recent season was in Fit Model. I did 3 shows this season, and I earned 2 pro cards in Fit Model. Yeah. And I'm also currently about to complete my bodybuilding certification from NASM. So that's also super exciting because I'm about to open up some coaching spots for lifestyle and competitors. If you like this style of instruction, we're probably going to be a good match. I'm very data driven. I'm very analytical. I like to give very actionable recommendations. And my passion is to design systems that are scalable and repeatable and also customizable. If you like my approach, you should absolutely reach out for a discovery call so we can see if we're a good fit for posing. So here's my process. I'm going to put the link down below for you to work with me or schedule a free discovery call. The first thing I'm going to do is audit. I'm going to analyze the starting point, right? We have to do an assessment and evaluate what are your needs and what are your pain points. And then in the second session, I will come to you with a plan of what I think we should do, a plan of action to get you from point A to point B. And then in our third session, we're going to actually get to the meat and potatoes and start working on each of the deconstructed problems in phases. Once you master each phase, then we're going to iterate and improve upon your previous learnings. Guys, I have spent a ton of money and a ton of time investing into learning what posing is. And here is one thing I can promise you. I don't like to waste my money and time, and I don't think other people should either. So one thing I can promise you is that I'm going to help you max out the ROI for any session that you have with me. I value balancing rigor and velocity, and I care very much about the quality of my work. So I hope this was super helpful. If you need hands-on help, definitely reach out. If you like this style of video, please engage and give me encouragement, because otherwise I don't know if I'm going to continue to make this type of content because it actually did take quite a bit of effort. So I'm putting this all out there. If I get a good response, I will likely continue. If I don't, I'm going to experiment with something else. So good luck with your posing. I hope this helps. If you're starting from 0, try out the ratios and the angles, and then use that as a baseline to iterate.